The mercury didn't just drop, it fell off a cliff. By 3 in the afternoon, the thermometer on the north post of the porch read -8, and the wind coming off the pass was already carrying the sharp, dry ice crystals that mean a storm isn't just passing through, it's settling in. I'm Ethan. For 3 years, I've worked as the sole wilderness forestry technician for District 4, living in a green-painted 3-room cedar station tucked into the timberline of the high ridge. My job is simple. I monitor the growth rates of subalpine fir, track soil moisture levels, and maintain the weather instruments that feed data to the valley below. Most of the time, the only voices I hear belong to the ravens or the occasional dispatcher on the morning radio check. It's a quiet life, structured by routine and the predictable physics of the woods. I like the silence. It doesn't ask for explanations, and it never tries to negotiate. Then came Claire. She arrived 4 days before the storm, representing the university's geology department, with 3 heavy, lockable aluminum cases of high-resolution seismometers and an attitude that suggested she had never met a boundary she couldn't analyze her way through. Her goal was to map the minor fault line running beneath the granite ridge, a project that her department head, a career bureaucrat named Dr. Vance, had been trying to shut down for 2 terms. Claire had 10 days to gather her primary readings, or Vance would pull her field budget and reassign her to cataloging core samples in a basement lab in Seattle. Our initial interaction had been brief and professional. I gave her the corner table in the main room for her maps, pointed out the firewood stack, and told her the generator ran on a strict 4 hours on, 8 hours off cycle to conserve diesel. She had nodded once, her eyes already scanning her topographical charts, and said, "I won't get in your way, Ethan." "Good," I'd replied. "The mountain has enough ways to get in ours." By the afternoon of the 4th day, the sky had turned the color of greasy iron. I stood on the porch, watching the pine tops lean hard to the south. The wind was a low, steady hum that vibrated through the floorboards of the cabin. On my desk, the barometer was bottoming out, its needle twitching downward like a nervous finger. Inside, Claire was staring at a ruggedized tablet screen, her fingers typing rapidly. Her tan field shirt was buttoned to the collar, and her hair was pulled back into a tight, practical knot. "You need to bring your sensors in from the lower shelf," I said, letting the heavy timber door click shut behind me. The warmth of the wood stove hit my face, smelling of dry pine and old iron. She didn't look up immediately. Her finger hovered over the screen, waiting for a data upload to complete. "The primary array needs another 6 hours of continuous recording to capture the deep granite baseline. If I pull them now, the noise from the storm will mask the signal." "If you don't pull them now," I said, stripping off my heavy leather work gloves and tossing them onto the bench by the door, "the snow will bury them 5 feet deep by midnight. You won't find them until May, and the freeze will crack the housings before then." She paused, her jaw tightening. I had seen that expression before. It was the look of a scientist weighing a career-defining measurement against the hard, unyielding reality of mountain geography. "The housings are rated to -20, she said, though her voice lacked its usual certainty. "The housings are," I agreed. "The lithium batteries aren't. They'll drop below critical voltage in 4 hours of direct ground contact at this temperature. Then your data loggers shut down anyway, and you lose the storage cache." She looked at me then, her gray eyes cool and calculating. "You're very sure of that? I've spent 3 winters up here, Claire. The mountain doesn't care about your research schedule." She stared at the tablet for 3 seconds, then stood up and reached for her insulated parka hanging by the stove. "Let's go. We have 20 minutes of light left. We didn't talk on the trail down to the lower shelf." The wind was too loud for conversation, tearing across the ridge and driving frozen needles of snow directly into our eyes. Every step was a lesson in balance. The ground was already slick, a thin glaze of black ice, hiding beneath a light dusting of powder. I kept my pace steady, my eyes fixed on the gray line of trees ahead, while Claire followed close behind, her heavy pack frame creaking with every step. We found the 3 sensors anchored to the granite outcrop. The metal casings were already coated in a delicate skin of frost, their green indicator lights blinking slowly. Claire knelt in the frozen dirt, her bare hands working the brass locking pins with a speed that spoke of long practice in cold places. I didn't offer to do it for her. She didn't ask. Instead, I stood on the windward side, using my body as a shield to keep the driving snow from packing into the open connection ports as she lifted each unit and slid it into her padded pack. By the time the 3rd sensor was secured, the light was entirely gone, replaced by a swirling, blinding wall of white. The temperature had plunged another 10 degrees. My face felt wooden, and my fingers inside my gloves were stiffening. "Go!" I shouted over the roar of the wind, pointing up the slope. "Keep the pine line on your left. Don't lose sight of my pack." She nodded, her hood pulled low. We climbed back up the ridge in silence, our breathing heavy and ragged in the thin air. The cabin's single porch light was a dim, yellow smudge in the white chaos, but we reached it. I pushed the door open, shoved Claire inside, and slammed the heavy oak door against the gale, throwing the brass deadbolt into place. The silence inside was sudden and heavy. The only sound was the crackle of the wood stove and the rapid synchronized thrum of our breathing. "That," Claire said, her voice shaking slightly as she unzipped her parka, "was closer than I intended." "That wasn't the storm," I said, walking to the window and scraping a small circle of frost from the pane. "That was just the front porch of it. The real system hasn't even hit the ridge yet." I checked the radio desk. The green light on the VHF unit was dead. I flicked the power toggle, but only a dry, empty static came through the speaker. The high-tension line that fed power up from the valley had finally snapped. We were on the generator now, and the diesel tank was only 3/4 full. No grid power, I noted, my voice even. The repeater at the pass must be down too. We're on local backup. Claire set her pack carefully on the dry floorboards, her fingers still red from the cold. She didn't complain. She walked over to her equipment cases, checked the seal on each one, and then turned to look at the small wood stove in the center of the room. "How long will the diesel last?" she asked. "If I run the generator, only for 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours at night to keep the water pumps from freezing and charge our devices, 6 days, maybe 7 if we're careful. And the wood? We have enough dry lodgepole pine in the lean-to for 5 days of continuous heat. If we keep the dampers down, we'll have to keep the temperature in here, around 55. Warm enough to survive, cold enough to keep the woodpile from vanishing before the road clears." Claire looked at the small room. The cabin was structured simply: a central room with the kitchen counter and wood stove, a small private bunk room with a single narrow cot that I usually used, and an unheated outer vestibule where we kept wet gear, boots, and tools. "The geology department's data unit," Claire said, pointing to a small, silver, suitcase-style case on her desk. "It houses the master hard drives for the seismic line. The drive lubricants are synthetic, but they thicken if the internal temperature drops below 40 degrees. If that happens, the read heads will scratch the platters when the system boots." "I need to keep that case in the main room near the heat." "The case stays on the table," I said. "That's fine, but we have another problem." She looked at me, her eyebrows rising slightly. "Which is?" "The bunkroom is too far from the stove. Without the electric baseboards, the temperature in there will drop below freezing by midnight. The only way to stay warm is to sleep in the main room near the stove." She looked at the narrow floor space. There was a single wooden cot in the bunkroom, and a small worn foam sleeping pad that I used for trail work stored in the corner. "I'll take the floor," I said, reaching for the foam pad. "I'll set up near the wood bin. You take the cot. We can drag the frame out of the bunk room and put it near the south wall. Claire shook her head. No. The cot frame is steel and heavy. If we drag it in here, we block the access path to the wood stove and the kitchen counter. We need to keep the floor clear so we can move around in the dark. I'll use the foam pad on the floor on the left side of the stove. You take your regular bunkroom cot. It's your cabin. The bunkroom is going to be 30 degrees. By midnight, Claire, I'm not sleeping in a freezer just to prove a point about hospitality. Then we both sleep in the main room, she said, her voice dropping into that calm, analytical tone she used when solving a logistics problem. You take the foam pad on the right. I'll take the left. But we have another issue. She walked over to the corner of the room where her gear was stored. She pulled out her sleeping bag, a lightweight, high-altitude synthetic bag, and held it up. The bottom foot of the green nylon was dark and dripping. During her scramble to pack the sensors, her water flask had leaked inside her pack, soaking the lower third of the insulation. The fill is clumped, she said, her finger pressing into the wet nylon. In this humidity, it won't dry out for 48 hours, even next to the stove. If I sleep in this tonight, my feet will be frozen by morning. I looked at the wet bag, then at my own sleeping gear. I had one heavy military-issue wool blanket and an old flannel-lined sleeping bag that had seen better days. We can hang your bag over the rafters above the stove, I said. It'll dry, but it's going to take time. In the meantime, you can use my sleeping bag. And what will you use? She asked, her eyes narrowing slightly. I have the wool blanket, I said, walking to the bunk room and pulling the heavy olive drab blanket off my cot. It's thick. It'll do. Claire looked at the blanket, then at the frost already creeping up the inside of the window panes. The cabin creaked as a massive gust of wind hit the north wall, the sound like a heavy fist pressing against the cedar siding. The air temperature in here is already down to 50, she said quietly. A single wool blanket on a foam pad over pine floorboards isn't enough to prevent mild hypothermia when the room drops to 40 overnight. I've read the meteorological logs for this station, Ethan. You don't have to act like a rugged mountain man just to keep me comfortable. I'm not acting, I said, laying the foam pad on the right side of the stove. I'm making a calculation. I have more body mass and a higher metabolic rate than you do. I can manage with the wool blanket if I sleep in my insulated wool shirt and thermal trousers. Claire walked over to her pack, pulled out a dry fleece, and stepped behind the small privacy screen in the corner to change out of her damp field clothes. When she stepped back out, she looked smaller, but no less determined. Her dark hair was loose now, falling over her shoulders in damp waves. She sat down on the left side of the stove, her back against her equipment cases. We only have one dry blanket, Ethan, she said, her voice steady but quiet. And your sleeping bag is narrow. If we try to split them, we'll both spend the night shivering. We need to pool the insulation. I looked at her. Her expression was completely devoid of flirtation or awkwardness. It was the same look she'd had when she analyzed the failing lithium batteries on the ridge. She was looking at two human bodies, a limited amount of thermal mass and a severe drop in ambient temperature. It was a physics problem. I don't want you to regret this, I said, my voice quiet. I'm not a difficult roommate, but I like my space. And I don't want you thinking I engineered this storm just to get close to the university's star geologist. A small, dry smile touched the corner of her mouth. The first real sign of humor I had seen from her since she arrived. I checked the NOAA models myself this morning, Ethan. Unless you have a direct line to the jet stream, I think your innocence is safe. Now let's set up the floor before the fire dies down. We laid the foam pad in the center of the floor, directly in front of the wood stove. We laid my flannel-lined sleeping bag open as a base layer, then draped her partially dry bag over the top as a secondary shield, keeping the wet bottom section far away from our feet. The heavy military wool blanket went over the top of everything. I'll keep the damper set low, I said, sitting on the edge of the improvised bed. The wood will burn slow, but I'll need to wake up every 3 hours to throw another log in. If I move, I'll try not to wake you. I sleep light, she said, sliding under the heavy wool blanket on the left side. Any change in the wind usually wakes me anyway. I lay down on the right, keeping a clear 6 inches of space between us. The floorboards were hard beneath the foam pad, but the heat from the stove was direct and comforting. Outside, the storm was fully awake. Now the wind howled through the high peaks, a wild, high-pitched shriek that made the sturdy logs of the cabin hum. "Claire," I said into the dark. "Yes, your academic director, Vance. Why is he trying so hard to kill your project?" I heard her shift slightly under the heavy wool. He wants the funding for his own research on deep mantle seismic modeling. My project is high risk because it requires physical field data from active fault zones. He thinks it's too expensive, too dangerous, and too dependent on luck. If I miss my deadline, or if the data is corrupted, he has the bureaucratic leverage he needs to declare my methodology non-viable and move my budget back to his lab. He sounds like a man who has spent too much time in offices, I said. He has, she agreed, her voice tight with a quiet anger. He hasn't been in the field in 15 years. He thinks the world behaves like his computer simulations. He doesn't understand that the Earth doesn't always follow the model. None of it does, I said. Not the Earth, not the weather, not even the wood stove if the pine draft is wet. She let out a soft, tired laugh. Good night, Ethan. Good night, Claire. I woke up at 2 a.m. The cabin was pitch black, save for the dull red glow of the wood stove's glass door. The air was cold, cold enough that my breath plumed in the faint light. My shoulder was stiff from the hard floor, but beneath the heavy wool blanket, the space between Claire and me was warm. She hadn't moved. She was curled on her side, her breathing slow and even, her face half hidden beneath the collar of her fleece. I slid out from under the blanket as quietly as possible, my boots making a soft creak on the dry pine boards. I opened the stove door, the orange light spilling across the room, and slid 2 thick logs of dry lodgepole pine onto the embers. The dry wood caught immediately, the yellow flames climbing the bark with a soft, cheerful hiss. Her voice was a low whisper from the dark. "Just feeding the stove," I said quietly, adjusting the air damper, until the roar of the draft settled into a steady hum. "Go back to sleep." "What's the temperature?" 48 in the room, I said, checking the small wall thermometer by the light of the stove, but the bed is holding heat. "We're fine." I climbed back under the blanket, careful not to pull the wool away from her shoulders. As I settled onto my side, she shifted, her back moving closer to mine until the warmth of her shoulder pressed against my shoulder blade. It wasn't an embrace. It was just 2 cold people finding the center of a shared shelter. "Thanks for saving the sensors," she murmured, her voice thick with sleep. "Don't thank me yet," I said. "We still have to get them down the mountain." By morning of day 2, the world outside had disappeared. The snow was stacked nearly to the midpoint of the south window, a solid white wall that filtered the morning light into a cold blue glow. I had to throw my weight against the front door, just to clear a space through the drift on the porch. The wind had dropped slightly, but the snow was still falling, thick, heavy flakes that piled up at a rate of 2 inches an hour. "The road is gone," I said, coming back inside and stamping the snow from my boots onto the heavy fiber mat. "The fire road down to the ranger station has at least 4 feet of fresh powder on it. No vehicle is getting up here for a week, not even the district's heavy plow." Claire was already at her desk, her geological data case open. She had rigged a small battery-powered lead to her laptop, transferring the raw data from the sensors we had recovered the night before. "The seismic lines are clean," she said, her eyes bright with a quiet excitement. The sensor we pulled from the lower ridge captured a series of minor microfractures along the fault line just as the pressure front dropped. "It's exactly what I needed to prove the correlation between atmospheric load shifts and low-frequency tectonic release. Congratulations, I said, setting a pot of water on the wood stove to boil. But your data won't do much good if we can't get it to the university before your deadline. The deadline is Friday at noon, she said, her excitement fading slightly as she checked her watch. That's 3 days from now. We'll need to use the shortwave, I said. If the repeater at the pass is dead, we might be able to reach base camp on the emergency simplex channel. Mark is the radio operator down there. If anyone can copy a manual data transmission, it's him. I fired up the generator at 9. The loud mechanical roar of the diesel engine cut through the silence of the clearing, a comforting reminder of utility. I sat at the radio desk tuning the frequency dial through the static until I heard a faint, broken signal. Station 4, copy over. Mark, this is Ethan at Station 4. Do you copy over? Ethan, copy you, weak but clear, and what's status up there? Over. We've got 5 feet of snow on the ridge and it's still coming down, I said, holding the microphone close to my mouth. Power is out. We're on generator. Claire is here with her data. Her road out is completely blocked. Do you copy? Over. The static crackled loudly. Then Mark's voice came back, accompanied by another sound, a sharp, clear voice in the background that I recognized immediately. Vance is here. Claire has missed her extraction window. He's filing the non-compliance paperwork, unless she delivers the raw set by Friday. Over. Claire stepped up beside me, her hand gripping the back of my chair. Her knuckles were white. Mark, this is Claire. Tell Dr. Vance the data is secured and processed. The route down is physically impossible. He can't file for non-compliance when the weather is at emergency levels. There was a long pause, filled with the dry hiss of the ionosphere. Then another voice cut through the static, clearer, colder, and entirely devoid of static. Dr. Thomas, this is Dr. Vance. The university's safety protocols are very clear. If a field researcher fails to maintain their extraction schedule due to poor planning, the department is not liable for budget overruns. You knew the storm risk. You chose to stay on the ridge. If your data isn't on my desk by Friday noon, I will freeze your account and reallocate the remaining research funds. Claire's face went completely pale. She opened her mouth to speak, but her throat seemed to tighten. I reached out, took the microphone from her hand, and pressed the talk button. Dr. Vance, this is Ethan Scott, lead forestry tech for District 4. I've been monitoring this ridge for 3 years. The pressure drop we recorded yesterday was a 12 millibar collapse in 20 minutes. That is a meteorological anomaly, not poor planning. If Dr. Thomas had attempted to descend the mountain yesterday afternoon, under your instruction, she would have been caught in the debris flow on the south slope. I have documented the saturation levels. If you penalize her for prioritizing survival over an arbitrary office schedule, my official incident log will go straight to the university's legal counsel. Do you copy that? Over the radio was silent for 5 long seconds. The static seemed to hold its breath when Vance's voice came back. It was clipped and defensive. The department expects a full safety report, and the data must still be verified. Friday noon, Dr. Thomas, no exceptions. The line clicked dead. Claire let out a long, slow breath, her hand resting on my shoulder now. Her touch was warm through my flannel shirt. He's not going to back down, Ethan. He wants that funding. Then we give him the data, I said, turning my chair to face her. But we do it on our terms. We have 48 hours. The snow will stop by tomorrow morning. If we can reach the granite ridge on snowshoes, we can access the Forestry Service's emergency fiber box at the high lookout. It's hardwired. It doesn't rely on the radio repeater. Claire looked at me, her eyes steadying as she processed the plan. The high lookout is 3 miles up the ridge. through 5 feet of fresh snow. It's a steep climb, I said, and the wind will be brutal, but it's our only shot. We spend today prepping the gear, checking the snowshoes, and conserving our wood. Tomorrow at dawn, we move. Okay, she said, her voice dropping back into that quiet, reliable focus. Show me the route. We spent the rest of day 2 in a quiet, intense rhythm of preparation. I worked in the unheated vestibule, checking the bindings on our magnesium frame snowshoes and waxing the wooden bases to prevent the heavy, wet snow from sticking. The cold in the outer room was sharp, but the physical labor kept my blood moving. Inside, Claire was preparing her data. She had copied the seismic files onto 3 separate flash drives, sealing each one in a waterproof plastic file with a packet of silica gel. She packed her ruggedized tablet into her insulated case, wrapping it in her dry fleece to protect the battery from the extreme cold we would face on the ridge. By afternoon, the cabin had grown quiet. The snow had finally tapered off into a light, lazy drift, but the sky remained a heavy, uniform gray. I heated a can of vegetable soup on the wood stove, adding some dried beef from my winter rations. It wasn't gourmet, but it was warm and heavy. We ate sitting on the floorboards by the stove, our shoulders almost touching in the narrow space. My Dean, Claire said suddenly, her spoon hovering over her metal bowl. He's not a bad scientist. He's just tired. He spent 10 years trying to get a project funded, and when it finally failed, he stopped looking at the Earth and started looking at the spreadsheets. I think he hates my project because it reminds him of what he used to want to do. The mountains have a way of doing that, I said, leaning my back against the wood bin. They make your plans look very small. Some people find that comforting. Others find it terrifying. Which one are you? She asked, her gray eyes fixing on mine. I like the smallness, I said. It means my mistakes don't carry much weight in the long run. If I do my job well, the trees grow. If I do it poorly, they still grow. The scale is correct. She watched me for a moment, her expression soft in the amber light of the stove. You're a very rare kind of man, Ethan. Most people up here are trying to conquer something. You're just living with it. Conquering a mountain is like conquering a wave, I said. You might stand on it for a second, but it's still going to crash. It's better to know how to swim. A soft, real laugh escaped her, and she reached out her fingers, lightly touching my wrist. Then I'm glad I'm swimming with you. The touch was brief, but the warmth of it stayed on my skin long after she drew her hand back. That night, the cold was even more intense. With the storm clearing, the clouds broke, and the heat radiated off the mountain into the empty sky. The temperature outside plunged to -15. We lay down on our shared floor bed, the wood stove ticking softly as the iron contracted in the cold. We didn't discuss the arrangement this time. It was a natural, silent agreement. We pulled the heavy wool blanket over our shoulders, our bodies aligning naturally to conserve the heat. I lay on my side, my arm tucked beneath my head. Claire shifted, her back settling against my chest, her warmth a steady, comforting presence against the cold seep of the floorboards. I could smell the faint scent of pine smoke and herbal soap in her hair. Ethan, she whispered. Yeah? Are your hands cold a little? I admitted. She reached back, finding my hand in the space between us, and pulled my fingers inside the sleeve of her dry fleece, pressing them against her warm wrist. Her skin was soft and incredibly warm. Team effort, she murmured, her thumb gently tracing the back of my hand. Team effort, I agreed. I didn't close my eyes for a long time. I listened to her breathing, the steady rise and fall of her ribs against my arm, and the quiet frozen silence of the mountain outside. For the first time in 3 years, the solitude of the station didn't feel like a shield. It felt like a space that had finally been filled. We left at 6 on day 3. The morning was a spectacular, brutal blue. The sun rose over the eastern peaks, turning the endless fields of snow into a blinding, glittering sheet of white that hurt the eyes even through our dark, polarized goggles. The air was so cold, it stung the back of my throat with every breath. We wore our snowshoes, our boots sinking 6 inches into the light powder before the frames caught. I carried the heavy safety pack with the ropes, the emergency radio, and the dry wood matches. Claire carried her insulated data case, strapped high on her chest, her arms folded over it to keep her body heat close to the batteries. The first mile is the hardest, I called back to her, my voice clear in the frozen air. It's all timber climbing. Watch the tree wells. If you fall into a pine pocket, the snow will swallow you whole before I can get a rope down. I'm right behind you, she said, her face red from the wind, but her eyes completely clear. We moved in a slow, rhythmic crawl. The silence of the forest was absolute, broken only by the steady, dry clack-clack of our snowshoe frames and the heavy, synchronized sound of our breathing. Every step required a conscious lift of the knee, dragging the weight of the snow frame through the drift before planting it again on the slope. By the second mile, the trees began to thin, replaced by the wind-scoured granite shelves of the upper ridge. The wind here was a constant biting force, driving the loose snow across the ice like white sand. Claire slipped once on a patch of blue ice hidden beneath the powder. She went down hard on her side, her pack frame creaking. I was beside her in 3 seconds, my hand grabbing her shoulder harness to keep her from sliding down the steep slope. You okay? The data case is fine, she gasped, her breath freezing instantly on her collar. I didn't drop it. I don't care about the case, I said, pulling her up until her boots found a flat ledge of rock. I care about your ankles. Can you stand? She stomped her left foot once, then her right. They're fine. The snow is soft enough that it broke the fall. Let's keep moving. The wind is picking up. We reached the high lookout at 11. The structure was a small octagonal wooden tower, anchored to the granite peak by massive steel guy wires. The windows were completely iced over, looking like solid blocks of frosted glass. I led her around to the windward side, where the snow had been swept clear by the gale, exposing the heavy iron junction box that housed the Forestry Service's emergency communication lines. This is it, I said, pulling my heavy multi-tool from my belt. My fingers were already stiffening in the biting wind, the cold cutting through my liner gloves like knives. I had to work the brass padlock on the box with the flat of my knife, chipping away a thick layer of ice before the key would turn. The padlock clicked open. Inside, the green diagnostic lights on the fiber modem were glowing. A beautiful synthetic green that meant the line down to the valley was intact. Connect the USB bridge, I told Claire, my voice hoarse from the cold. She unzipped her parka, pulled the insulated data case out, and connected the high-speed transfer cable to the modem port. Her fingers were shaking, but her movements were precise. The terminal is active, she said, her laptop screen flickering to life in the shadow of the junction box. I'm routing through the university's secure server now. I stood behind her, using my wide shoulders and my heavy winter coat to block the wind, creating a small, quiet pocket of air over her screen. Upload starting, she whispered, her eyes fixed on the progress bar. 12%. Forth the wind howled across the peak, a savage, cold roar that shook the heavy iron box. A cloud of fine ice crystals blew under my hood, stinging my cheeks. 50%. Come on, I muttered, my eyes scanning the ridge below. The weather was holding, but the temperature was dropping again as the afternoon shadow began to stretch across the valley. 80%, 95. Upload complete. File verified on the university main server. Claire let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. She closed the laptop, secured the waterproof port cover, and locked her case with a decisive snap. We did it, she said, looking up at me through her frosted goggles. Vance has the files. The timestamp is locked. He can't touch the funding now. Let's get off this peak, I said, my hand resting on her shoulder. My toes are starting to lose feeling, and I don't feel like treating frostbite with snow rub tonight. We descended the ridge much faster than we had climbed it, the gravity working in our favor as our snowshoes slid smoothly through the deep drifts. By the time we reached the timberline, the wind had dropped, and the woods were silent again, wrapped in the quiet blue shadow of the winter afternoon. We reached the cabin at 4. Inside, the air was cold but dry and safe. I started the wood stove immediately, throwing 3 thick logs of pine onto the remaining coals. The warmth grew slowly, filling the small room like a physical presence. We stripped off our heavy outer layers, our boots clattering on the hearth mat. Claire sat on the floor by the stove, her hands held close to the iron door, her whole body shaking with the delayed reaction of the extreme cold. I went to the kitchen counter, poured 2 fingers of whiskey from my private bottle into 2 metal cups, and handed one to her. "Drink," I said, sitting beside her. "It'll open the blood vessels in your fingers." She took the cup, her fingers touching mine. They were still cold, but her grip was strong. She took a slow sip, her eyes closing as the spirit hit her throat. "That," she said, her voice dropping into a low, warm register, "is the best thing I have ever tasted." "It's cheap rye," I said, taking a sip from my own cup. "But on a mountain, everything tastes better." She set her cup down, her eyes opening to look at me. The red light at the stove door flickered across her face, highlighting the sharp, clean lines of her jaw and the soft, intelligent curve of her mouth. "You saved my research, Ethan," she said quietly. "If you hadn't been here, I would have stayed on that lower shelf to finish the recording, and I probably would have frozen with the sensors." "You wouldn't have frozen," I said. "You're too stubborn for that. You would have found a way to build a snow cave and keep the batteries warm with your own teeth," she laughed, a soft, musical sound that filled the small timber cabin. "Maybe, but your way was much warmer." She shifted closer, her shoulder pressing against mine. This time there was no cold to escape, no survival calculation to make. It was just 2 people who had run out of reasons to keep their distance. Poor. I reached out, my fingers gently catching her chin, and turned her face toward mine. Her eyes were dark and wide, reflecting the small orange flame of the stove. "Claire," I said quietly. "I know," she whispered. I kissed her. Her lips were soft, smelling of rye whiskey and cold pine air. She moved closer, her arms wrapping around my neck, her body warm and solid against mine. The kiss was slow, deep, and entirely devoid of the professional boundaries we had spent 3 days constructing. It felt like the natural resolution of a long, quiet storm. The rescue snowcat arrived on the morning of day 5. The heavy diesel engine grumbled in the clearing, its wide rubber tracks packing down the deep drifts. Mark was at the controls, his bright red winter jacket a loud artificial splash of color against the white woods. "You 2 look like you survived," he called out, climbing down from the cab with a thermos of hot coffee. "We did," I said, carrying Claire's heavy aluminum equipment cases down from the porch. Though we had to use the high lookout to send her data. "I saw the log," Mark said, shaking his head. Vance was furious. He spent yesterday afternoon trying to find a loophole in the university charter, but the board had already reviewed Claire's seismic files. "The correlation data is too good, Ethan. They've already approved her for the next 3 years of the research grant." Claire stepped down from the cabin porch, her pack frame secured, her dark hair tucked beneath her woolen cap. She looked at the mountain, then at the small cabin, and finally at me. "Are you coming down with us?" she asked. "I have to stay," I said. "The weather station needs a manual recalibration after a freeze like this, and I have some trail markers to clear before the next front hits." Her face fell slightly, but she nodded, her eyes holding mine with a quiet, private intensity. She walked over, her boots crunching in the packed snow, and stopped inches from me. The grant, she said quietly. It includes funding for a permanent meteorological consultant. Someone who knows the terrain, knows the weather, and knows how to keep my sensor and me from freezing. That sounds like a very demanding position, I said, a small smile touching my mouth. It is, she agreed. The candidate has to be comfortable with tight spaces, limited wood supplies, and a very strict boundary protocol. I have some experience in that field, I said. I'll file an application. She smiled, her eyes bright with a reflection of the winter sun. She reached out, her hand sliding under my heavy work glove to find my bare wrist, her fingers pressing warm against my skin, for 3 short, perfect seconds. I'll see you in the valley, Ethan. I'll be there, I said. I watched the snowcat turn and crawl down the fire road, its yellow safety lights flashing against the white pines, until it disappeared around the bend of the ridge. The silence returned to the clearing. Heavy, cold, and clean. I walked back up to the porch, my boots making a solid, familiar sound on the timber floorboards. I opened the door of the cabin. The smell of pine smoke and herbal soap still hung in the warm air by the stove. I sat at the radio desk, opened my logbook, and picked up my pencil. Day 5, station secure, route cleared, temperature rising, team stable. For the first time in 3 years, the cabin didn't feel empty when the door shut. It just felt like the pause before the next season began.